replacement fire and smoke actuators and the codes and standards that involve that. There's really very little technical here, but I'll let you know about other classes that are coming up. And I will give you my email address if anyone has any questions or further classes they want. So the goal of what we're talking about here is we find an old actuator on an older damper. Many of them, I see stuff 40 years old even. But we've got that old one over there on the left side of the screen, and we want to replace that old motor. What are the codes and standards that are going to govern our activities? Here's our agenda. We're going to hit the codes and standards first, and then a little bit about AHJ, and then what kind of instructions we have and what's in them. And big question I get a lot of, well, how do I talk to the fire marshal or building official? And then what technical classes we might have that you can let us know you want. Anything involving either the technical or the codes and standards starts with the damper, not the actuator. Every day I get someone who's doing a replacement, and they'll send me a picture of an old motor, and that doesn't help much. We need to look at the damper because their same motor can be applied a lot of different ways. So there are technical aspects that we really need to know just to make sure we're doing it right, and to assure the AHJ, the fire marshal or building official, that we're doing it right. So here's the codes and standards. Code, that's law. But the codes don't detail anything about replacement. You see very little other than everything should be in working order, particularly life safety systems, and now and then a permit requirement. But even that isn't covered too well. Now, standards become part of the code only if they're referenced by the code. And otherwise they're just guideline or information. So there's certain standards that really matter and a lot of other standards that don't matter. But the codes reference an awful lot of standards. So the International Building Code there on the left picture, and then the International Fire Code are the two main ones that we're going to bump into as far as the codes go. I'll let you read this rather than reading from the screen. The two big important ones are the top two. But the most important is actually the local codes, because you will find variations and some things written in that are changed. Sometimes they're heavily modified. California and New York have a lot of changes in the International Building Code. The standards that matter, and actually the codes reference these standards, and it becomes the standards that are most important in replacement fire and smoke. So NFPA 80 is fire doors, dampers, and actually air curtains are covered in 105 also. And 80 is very important. NFPA 105, that's the smoke dampers, very important. Now, each have only one chapter on dampers. They're heavily door oriented, but they're the two overriding standards that are going to give us most of the rules for replacement. And the fire code has some important stuff. NFPA 92 does cover smoke control systems and has some remarks in it, but it's really repeating what's in the other standards. There are 3 UL standards, the UL 555 family of standards, that cover fire and smoke dampers and ceiling dampers. Those are important in new construction, primarily because that's what they govern, factory construction. They don't matter for retrofit very much, other than that one shouldn't change anything so that you've deviated from the accepted testing. So the three that matter the most for retrofits are NFPA 80, 105, and 92. Testing. Each of those standards and the International Building Code mentions some testing requirements, but none of those are complete. The only complete document is the International Fire Code. It covers all the testing requirements. So I look to the International Fire Code as my main guide. But periodic testing to make sure the dampers work is required. So at the top there, the Chapter 7 are structural elements. Any dampers put in under Chapter 7 requirements will need to be tested commissioning, and then at the end of the first year, and then every 4 years in commercial, and every 6 years in hospitals. The hospitals are excellent about checking their dampers and making sure everything works. Commercial buildings are very hit or miss. The fire marshals are pretty well burdened, and even though it's the building owner's responsibility, in the commercial area we don't see a high amount of adherence to these codes and standards. The International Fire Code covers the smoke control system dampers. IBC doesn't. And once we have a dedicated system, well, you got to, of course, commission them, and then every half a year, make sure it works. If it's not dedicated, in other words, part of the HVAC system, typically, then after commissioning, you only have to do it annually. Your control panels, your fire detection and smoke control larger system, if they're dedicated, that panel has to do a weekly self-test. If it's not dedicated, you don't have to do any testing. That one always puzzles me. But the periodic testing is where we find defective actuators. It's the #1 failure point when testing is done, and that's when replacement is required. Permits. Codes don't cover it too much, but common sense can give us some of the ideas. I'll let you read this. In almost all jurisdictions, replacement of a fire and smoke actuator is considered an ordinary repair. If you get a young inspector, he might want more. You get the older guys, they've already been through the repair and replacement issues, and so they're not as worried about it. But you do have to leave on site either a copy of the invoice or a logbook that shows what repairs you've been taking care of. This is what UL has to say about the subject. The UL 555 family of standards are factory standards. They're new construction oriented. When it comes to replacement, a lot of the old actuators are no longer available, so you do have to take a good look at it. And if the manufacturer has any kinds of rules, then you should look to them. So you look to the damper manufacturer for the replacement issues. People always want to make sure that they're in accordance with UL 555, and although it doesn't really involve itself at all with replacement issues, it gives some assurance to know what the test is about. So the actuators are cycled 20,000 times on the damper. That tests both the damper and the actuator. On first time dampers, the dampers will be subjected to elevated temperatures for a half hour, and then they have to operate open and close 3 times. That test is not as difficult as the heated airflow test. So once the dampers pass that temperature degradation, typically UL will simply require the heated airflow test, where they heat them up and put them under a high torque load. There's other tests that are involved. The fire test is the big expensive one for the damper if it's fire and smoke. Salt spray for accelerated life cycle, and drop tests to make sure they're structurally sound. But again, the UL 555S is not a replacement-oriented standard. Now, when you get to NFPA 80 and 105, they are replacement-oriented. So they do mention some of the things that are important. So that first item there, this is only 3 out of about 15 things, but you got to document everything you're doing to make sure that you've been doing your periodic testing, and then you've got to leave a record on premises. 773 is important. If something's broken, fix it. 105 says repair as soon as possible, and 80 says immediately. A lot of people are afraid about replacement fire and smoke actuators as though they can't touch them, and the truth is it's the exact opposite. You are required to fix this stuff. And then, of course, once you've finished any repairs, you're going to test it for proper operation. It's common sense, but you don't walk away from something without testing it. So here are what we're looking at. 555 is fire dampers. 555S, smoke dampers. NFPA 80 is fire. 105 is smoke. And those are the primary standards that one has to look at. But the local and state codes override any of those standards, and whatever the AHJ says is the way it's going to have to be. You can talk to him about things if you disagree with him, and he'll listen. They're good. But again, 555 is factory construction, not field repair. 80 and 105 are the primary repair issue standards. Okay, what about the AHJ? Now and then, it'll be the property owner or his designated agents. Most of the time, it's the fire marshal or the building official. It tends to be the fire marshal west of the Mississippi, building official east of the Mississippi. He is the final authority over any replacement issues. But again, the local codes may have some special provisions, not in the I codes. And then the AHJ will determine how he wants things handled. I love that picture on the right with the board holding the damper open. I actually recommended on that job that, oh, yeah, those dampers should be replaced. But the fire marshal had already approved the actuator replacement, and things went well. So when you work with the AHJ, I've had no questions ever that you can't or can't repair a functioning damper. You got to replace that actuator as soon as possible. The two big questions always become, is the damper in functioning order? Some are not. In that case, you do have to replace the whole damper. And do you need a permit and inspection? Not too frequent that you need a permit inspection. New York City does require a permit for more than 10, and whether they do any inspections, I don't know. You probably allow them to leave the actuators. I haven't. Once we're at that stage, nobody talks to me. I highly recommend that one submit our instructions or leave them on the job site, because they do cover a lot of the replacement issues. So whenever I'm working with the HJ, I just try to make sure I explain the situation. You know, what building is it? What are the defective motors? Damper make, which they usually could care less. I make sure that, why I bring up the damper make is I make sure that we're UL 555S listed with that damper. That should be a requirement, although it's not in any of the codes or standards. I try to make sure they know we're going to follow 80 and 105. And then I ask them to confirm that that's what they want. And sometimes they have an objection, usually involving the fire alarm system. If we've touched any fire alarm wiring, they want to retest. And that's only logical. When we do get involved in this, if they don't know me, and by now most of these inspectors have bumped into Belimo, but now and then there isn't, I just try to make sure they know that we are very involved in the market. We're probably about a 75% market share now, but we do have California State Fire Marshal listing, New York City OTCR, which is essentially that we're UL listed, and they make sure that everything's okay. We did have MEA approval way back when, but it hasn't been in effect since about 2007. We have UL 2043, which is becoming important. That is now required by both the International Mechanical Code and, more importantly, by the NEC, which is every state, that the actuators have to have been tested for low smoke generation. And we've got ISO 9001, and our failure rate is absurdly low. It's not perfect, but it's very, very good. I try to make sure that they always know we're going to use an equal or better actuator. We're going to have more torque. All our technical specs are going to be the same. We're going to test after the actuator is replaced. And alarm wiring is very important to the inspectors, and we're going to retest and make sure we don't mess with any of it. And now and then you got to move some part of a wall to even get into the actuator. The space constraints can be severe. If there's any structural change made, permit will be obtained. They'll make sure that typically it's the drywall is been replaced and sealed, and any fire stopping done. Sometimes I'll get some inspector who says I want a like for like, and they almost mean identical when they say that, and it's impossible to do identical on these old dampers. On the lower right side there, there's some of those motors that don't exist anymore. They aren't made. So what we're going to do is replace them with ones of equal or more torque and speed. That is absolutely okay with UL. Now and then, someone needs a recertification. UL does have a field group that will go out and look at the damper and look at the current procedure. They will only issue new tags if the damper was made since 2002, because they don't keep the old list of actuators and dampers, the old procedures. So in that case, they only give you a letter of compliance. I've had to do that once in 15 years, 14 years, so it's not frequently requested. Or the alternative is always to replace the whole damper, which can be very expensive. Pneumatic to electric, I do a lot of. And in those cases, we're going to need it at the very minimum an electrical permit because we're running power up to them. And now and then we're going to want to look at exactly how they're going to do the heat responsive devices. The old ones use a variety of methods. So when you go to Pneumatic to electric, you are re-engineering a little bit. And I will write special instructions for most of those. We have a lot of installation instructions on our website, or I'll custom make them for people. We want to make sure that everything is being performed correctly. We've all got a liability here, and we've got a responsibility to make sure the smoke control systems or the dampers are working properly. So I highly recommend that one uses our instructions on any replacement, and I submit them to the AHJ frequently. It does give us credibility, but most important is that we do everything correctly. The instructions cover the UL statements, the code and standard issues, so that if you got a newer inspector, he can see what you're looking at, in particular NFPA 80 and 105. And then there's a cross-reference on the motors themselves, but wherever possible, I've put in step-by-step replacement instructions. And I do cover the typical wiring to bring it up to current standards. And there is a form for the fire marshal or building official that has a checklist that we tested it properly. And that's the final say of everything. If you cut power and it springs closed, or if you take a heat gun and heat up the heat responsive device and make sure that you reset it, now you have proven that that thing functions properly. When I'm speaking with the AHJ, sometimes I've bumped into newer guys and they want to know a little more detail, so we make sure they know the what number we have of defective actuators, that we make sure that we're UL listed with the damper manufacturer. We're listed with almost everybody except a couple of very small ones. The alarm wiring, very important that we're not touching it. There's one code, and I forget which one it was, that if you've even done any work within 6 feet of alarm wiring, you're supposed to retest. They've had problems with people disconnecting alarm wiring. If there's any structural changes, of course, we're going to get a permit. We're going to test the damper afterwards, and we can give a copy of the instructions to the fire marshal or the building official. And then I ask them if there's anything else that they need. It's very straightforward, just trying to make sure we do everything properly. We have some technical classes. 80% of replacements are pretty easy. It's a remove the old motor and drop a Belimo over the damper shaft. But sometimes you run into little wrinkles. And I cover those in classes on the, primarily focused on the dampers, but with the actuator replacement. Our website, up there at the top, we've got instructions and various technical documents. We've got the U.S. Marking Guide statement, the fire marshal building form if anyone needs it. And then one can submit those instructions to the AHJ. The classes cover wiring, the dampers. I've got a lot of extra classes that people want now and then on the types of dampers. There was an article, actually a series of 3 articles published in the Building Safety Journal since December, covering all the types of dampers. So we have material like that available, and if you ask questions, I'll try to help. My email's up there at the top, and Michaela's is there. So you can contact either of us with request for classes. The technical questions would go to me. I'm going to leave this up here in case anyone wants to copy those.
All right, Larry. It looks like we've come to the question and answer session. So for those of you who joined us maybe partway during the presentation, just a friendly reminder, we have recorded this webinar and we'll be posting it to YouTube. So if you do have any questions, now is the time that you can type in your question into the question box. I will read it aloud and Larry will answer it as best as possible. If for some reason we do not get to your question, we will be reaching out to you as a follow-up. So are you ready for the first question?
Yes, I am.
Okay. This is a long question, so if you need me to break it up, I will. Is it stated in code or standards anywhere on how a fire and smoke system receives position feedback from the damper/actuator? I.e., do internal end switches on actuators meet code for position feedback as opposed to end switches on the damper?
The codes clearly state that position feedback is required on engineered smoke control system dampers. So that's a Chapter 9 application. Chapter 7, it is not required. Internal end switches or auxiliary switches do meet codes in California and New York. Most other cities accept them quite well. There was in the past a lot of problem with that because you had broken linkages on the old type motors, frequent disconnected linkages, they weren't broken, that then you wouldn't have your position feedback working. So now there are 3 methods that are accepted. The actuator auxiliary switches, damper blade switches, or magnetic switches. But one would have to check with their local authority to make sure if it becomes an issue. Roughly 25% of our actuators go out with auxiliary switches.
Okay, on to the next question. What damper information do you need when replacing actuators?
I like to get the make and model number. I can't always get that. UL requires that the label be on the damper blade. Well, after 20 years of air flowing over it, that label is no longer visible, if it's even there. Reason why I like to make sure we are UL listed with that damper manufacturer. Although that's not required by code, it should be. The size matters a lot, and whether it's parallel or opposed blade. Typically, people send me pictures. Everyone's got cameras on their phones now, and that makes it very good for me to get a few pictures, and then I can identify what damper make and model, and whether we have temperature sensors or not.
Okay. Next. Sorry, Larry, didn't mean to cut you off. All right, next question. You mentioned that hospitals are good in testing their dampers. Is this because of JCAH accountability or self-responsibility?
Checo.
Okay. I'm going to answer a question that just came about. The question is, when and what will the name of the webinar be available on YouTube? So our YouTube presentation, or we will post this recording to YouTube probably by tomorrow morning, and it will be under the Belimo Air Controls page on YouTube. So if you just type in YouTube and Google in the search engine on YouTube, type in Belimo Air Controls, we should pop up. And then you'll see all our other videos and webinars. We have another question for you. Who are the AHJs in different parts of the country?
Almost always, it's the building official east of the Mississippi, and it is the fire marshal west of the Mississippi. But of course, they do talk to one another. They all go to the same ICC meetings. Now and then, I had a job in New York where the hospital was very aggressive about their replacement, and the state fire marshal declared that they were their own AHJ. So now and then you see something like that.
Okay, we have time for one more question. If we have not been able to get to your question, I will personally send Larry all of your questions, and he will be able to answer them via email or via the phone. So the last question I'm going to take is on multi-section dampers. Hold on, my screen's moving. Sorry, everyone. On multi-section dampers, under what conditions? Sorry, just got a bunch of questions coming in. Okay, on multi-section dampers, under what conditions would replacement actuators be able to be replaced one at a time versus all actuators needing to be replaced together?
Good question. I haven't ever replaced just one of a group of actuators. I've always encouraged replacing all of them at the same time. If the damper sections are connected, and UL used to require this all the time, that you've got a jack shaft, maybe two jack shafts and a tie bar between them, all the damper sections have to close simultaneously. You should replace all actuators with the same model, so that your spring time is the same for all of them and your drive open time is the same for all of them. Otherwise, they'll fight one another. Now, if you had multi-sections and one of them closed while the other stayed open or was still partially open, you could have very high velocity air through that partially open damper that might put enough force load on the blades that it couldn't close. So that's the reason why I've always wanted to replace all actuators on a multi-section rather than just one here and one there. If there's enough dampers in the building and you save those old actuators that were still working, you could use them to replace on one of the other dampers in the building. I hope I was clear there.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. Larry, thank you so much for doing an excellent job. And as I stated earlier, if we did not get to those questions, we will be answering them at a later time. I want to thank you for joining the webinar today. And please be advised that our next webinar will take place on August 23rd at 1 p.m. And it's going to be on correcting low delta T in buildings with district cooling. Thank you so much and have a great day.